Good morning, everybody. My name is Martin Postle. I'm the Deputy Director for Grants and Publications at the Mellon Centre. Put specs on so I can actually see. It's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce the first session here this morning. I'm pleased to be introducing a session on local landscape. Now, local, it's a word and it's a term that's had a hard time, I think, in recent years. A little while ago, the BBC, in its wisdom, replaced local news or regional news with the news where you are. I don't know what Now, perhaps this was in an attempt to avoid the suggestion that you, in your local regional setting, were on the margins or the periphery, and rather than more relevant people in the metropolis. Yet in my youth, where I grew up in Tyneside, local had a sense of pride, identity, and belonging, and it was very important. Local history society, the local literary and philosophical society, and so on. So there was a sense of being rooted, not being parochial, but actually caring and belonging for the landscape that you grew up in, and having an intimate knowledge of that landscape. It's interesting that it was some 70 years ago that William George Hoskins, W.G. Hoskins, the economic historian, founded the first university department in local history at the University of Leicester. And he had that post from 1938. And that was years before he published his seminal work, The Making of the English Landscape, which I think is a book as relevant today as it ever was. And if I was ever cast on a desert island or be asked to be, that's the book I'd be taking with me. So the first two papers that we're looking at today will address local in the sense of the physicality of the landscape and its material presence. And the first speaker is Anna Reid. Anna is a curator, a writer, and she's a Ph.D. She's doing a Ph.D. at the University of Northumbria. She worked as a director of the Leeds-based commissioning organisation Pavilion earlier on. She has a BA from Cambridge, an MA from Goldsmiths, and a Ph.D. will have a Ph.D. from the University of Northumbria. Now, Anna, in her paper abstract, mentions two individuals that she's kind of yoking together. The first is Paul Nash, the artist, and he needs probably little introduction in certain ways. There was an excellent exhibition at Tate Britain, so very familiar. The other individual is, I think, to most of us, rather less well known, and that's Arthur Holmes. Arthur Holmes is a fascinating character. And considering, I was thinking about the local in introducing this, and I was very surprised and pleased to recall that Arthur Holmes and I grew up about 3 streets apart in Gateshead. Not just any old Gateshead, but a place called Low Fell. He has a blue plaque now. I yet to actually get that, but you never know. Time will tell. So it's where we both spent our childhood, mulling over local history, and he was more into the geology side of things. And I'm also pleased, as a proud boast, as a Gateshead lad, that he's the only person from Gateshead to have a crater named after him on Mars, which is something else I've yet to achieve. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Anna, and then we're going to have another Anna Falcini, who's going to give another paper. So we're going to go 20 minutes, and then we're going to go straight into some very lively and enjoyable discussion. So I'd just like to invite Anna to take the podium.
So thank you for the introduction, and I'd like to say thank you to everyone at the Paul Mellon Centre, and also to Professor Issan-Holt, and to say that an expanded version of this material will be published in Visual Culture in Britain next year. So my aim is to show that when situated in its geological context, the landscape work of Paul Nash can be read as a prescient realism. Nash's career coincides with a period of astounding geological discovery, new knowledge of the radioactivity of the Earth and its legibility through mathematics. In part, this is owing to the other periods of his work, the emergence of modern the concurrence of Nash's work with this discovery is under-recognised. In part, this is owing to the other coincidence of his work with the emergence of modernist critical thought in Britain, which was exactly turned away from the possibility of ontological description and the history and art thereof. Given contemporary conditions wherein the development of the same modernist critical thought has reached a culmination and the draw of the geological and cosmological real is strong, Nash's work, read as intense realism, offers a rich precedent. Nash's work is invariably described first as English. I propose here that the English concept of the land at play in the work has to do with discovery and universal new insight. From the perspective of a modernist critic in England, interested in the imperative to break with the immanent and to pursue international critical dialogue, Nash's refusal to be untethered from the landscape appeared at best insular. Yet the English adjective is invested in a way that has not been recognised, and in a way that does not contradict the modern reverence for the virtuosity of human perception. In tandem with the course of Nash's work, scientists in England were privy to a startling new geophysical knowledge of the land. Arthur Holmes, a geologist and physicist, was conducting pioneering research into radioactive processes. Observations by Marie and Pierre Curie dating from 1898 had pointed to a land alight with radioactivity, previously unseen and entirely unsuspected. By 1913, Holmes had published a resplendent new reading of the geological land in the first edition of his The Age of the Earth. As a physics undergraduate at Imperial College, Holmes had taken a course in geology in 1910 and then pursued a line of inquiry tracing the rates of decay of radium into helium and of uranium into lead. Holmes proceeded to work with the physicist Frederick Soddy, who had discovered that elements exist in diverse isotopes. They worked together using mathematics to read complex sequences of radioactive decay from one isotope to another, occurring in diverse rock samples. From these legible sequences arose new radiometric dating. Holmes worked complex and elegant equations to put an age of 370 million years on a mineral in a Devonian Norwegian rock, vastly older than the extant estimated age of the Earth at 100 million years. 3 editions of Holmes's book gave vivid and accessible accounts of this new vision of the land. The 1927 edition was part of the Benn Sixpenny Library, which aimed at a general audience. The new research was well aired in the public domain. From 1929, the BBC published The Listener as a weekly magazine. The science section of the very first edition featured Revolutionary Discoveries, a text describing spontaneous radioactivity. Nash wrote art criticism and reviews for The Listener on a regular basis. Following the Great War, the science community was receptive to the concept of the land as more complex, intricate, and legible than ever imagined, a land replete with new avenues for research. Amidst increasingly precise radiometric estimates at this time arose an equation solved, putting an age on the Earth of around 3,000 million years. Historian of geology Martin Rudwick notes the universal implications for the Earth itself, but also for the Earth in relation to the Sun, the solar system, and the cosmos, citing geologist William Solas, who described the geologist who before had been bankrupt in time now finds himself suddenly transformed into a capitalist, with more millions in the bank than he knows how to dispose of. This was not the first occasion of geological revelation in the English and British context. Ruskin's landscape vision derives from the original insights of geology as they played out in the 19th century. Ruskin's evangelical torsions tend to obscure his vital original aesthetics, which was hand in hand with the founding insights of geological science. The new science recognised in the superpositions of the land an Earth that was vastly older than imagined and quite removed from the theological narrative of a young anthropocentric Earth created for and at the same time as man. Ruskin studied with William Buckland, the first reader in geology at Oxford. Buckland was opening a space for the new science at a university that was principally dedicated to the training of clergymen. In his Modern Painters, Ruskin urged artists to study geology. His interest in Turner was as a painter of vital new geological truth. Of the fall of the Tees, he said, with this drawing before him, the geologist could give a lecture upon the whole system of aqueous erosion. Throughout the British landscape tradition, there is an impetus to devise new strategies to visualise a previously unknown or unseen land, and this could be described as the geological impetus. In a 1934 text, Contributions to Unit 1, Nash refers to his imaginative research in the hidden land. He recalls the hidden land that is gleaned in the work of Turner. He recalls Blake's Albion and the renewed task of the landscape artist. Nash's endeavours have often been read as Blakean, as seeking the spirit of the land or place, the genius loci. In this and in new neo-romantic reading, Nash's hidden land is envisaged as a spiritual sphere and realm of the mind, theological and connected to Christian sciences. I quote David Mellon, soaring rhetoric of spirit over the material world. A reading with geological context can also pull Nash's unseen land back to a material dimension, less emanating spirit of place and more as literally emanating land. In 1927, Holmes described a magnificent unseen earth, veined with emanating radioactive minerals from Ceylon to St. Ives, Katanga to the Morne Mountains. He details the high-velocity ejections of electrically charged helium atoms that are alpha rays, long and intricate patterns of transformations that can be traced, each accompanied by an explosive liberation of energy. These revolutionary discoveries were described as the processes going on in a garden. Nash's unseen landscape, too, I quote from his text of the same name, is a land of stones, bones, empty fields, back gardens, alive with new intrigue and offering endless possibilities of fresh adventure. His is a view into a land seething with processes of decay and transformation, bleached objects, blanched springs and branches, mutilated by shafts of light. It is not a residual landscape, but one of terrific animation, traversed by the radiance of the sun and the moon, beating down on glinting white. Nash distinguishes this first vision of the wild privacy of his unseen landscape from its romantic and theological forebears, describing it as neither moral nor sentimental nor literary in character. This is not a Victorian theological unseen land, read and presented as a display of moral insight, nor is it a lost spiritual origin of a fallen materiality, a denuded romantic land. The unseen landscapes that Nash envisages, he reconfirms, are not part of the unseen in a psychic sense. They belong to the world that lies visibly about us. Nash's hidden lands are, I quote, unseen merely because they are not perceived. Only in that way can they be regarded as invisible. They are a materiality that is not visible to the unaided eye. The discovery of the radioactive land was also a discovery of intricate and legible sequences and patterns. In 1926, Holmes described his research, citing Swinburne. Man can see through the years flowing around him, the law lying under the years. A standout observation of the new geological discovery was that radioactive decay takes place in minerals at rates that are constant throughout deep time. Holmes describes radium. Now, if an atom of radium loses an atom of helium and part of its hidden store of energy, the atom that remains must be transformed into something different. Close examination revealed the genesis of a new element, as gas known as radium emanation. This in turn breaks down, and in its place another element, radium A, arises. A long succession of similar transformations can be traced. Nash's interest in pattern has recently been described by Inga Fraser as a search for an order, and in line with the mediumistic concept of the land as offering a glimpse of another metaphysical reality. Yet Nash's work can also be read as dealing with the literal and immanent geological appearance of order and pattern, as seeing for the first time a land infused with design of an intricacy quite beyond belief, an unseen material land that in its immanent self radiates transcendence. Nash made streams of photographs observing and visualizing sequences and patterns made by design and otherwise. The ploughed earth, a cobbled road, the rhythm of the stones of a wall, the surface of the sea. These overlooked forms of the earth are newly bestowed with intrigue, signalling the discovery of long invisible processes. Nash's preferred medium in this capture of pattern is apposite. A chapter of The Age of the Earth addressing radioactivity opens by describing the photographic plate and Becquerel's discovery of emanation, such that, I quote, uranium salts and minerals give out invisible rays which are capable of penetrating black paper and of revealing their existence by their effect on a photographic plate wrapped within it. This context of radiation given, it is possible to revisit a set of the artist's 1940s landscapes, saturated as they are in colour and viscous rays, evoking the legion processes of the radiating land. There is a darker aspect too. In 1938, German scientists split the atom, the uranium nucleus, into two pieces, freeing enormous amounts of energy. The very same discoveries that had animated the Earth were pointing towards a dreadful miracle, Nash's words, to which Nash alludes in his 1945 Flight of the Magnolia. On the 7th of August 1945, the Times described this harnessing of the basic power of the universe, Truman's phrase, the force from which the sun draws its power. In 1936, Nash reflected on a review of his found object interpreted, exhibited that year as part of the International Surrealist exhibition in London and described as an awkward object to have knocking around in the unconscious. From that little remark, Nash retorted, anyone might say to himself, oh, so that is what Mr. Nash finds in his unconscious, whereas actually I found it on the Romney Marsh. Nash's prosaic response is not only a joke, I propose, and it should be heard in its fullest sense, which geological context allows. Breton described the surrealist object as deriving from dream or the waking unconscious and its capacity to unleash and vitalize powers of invention, to depreciate those objects of usefulness which clutter the so-called real world. I'm citing Breton's 37, The Crisis of the Object. Breton describes the disruptive, perturbing potential of surreal objects in the problematic context of modern rationality and its unprecedented desire to objectify. He alludes to this concept of his concept of the marvelous in such experimentation, the experience is derived from dream and the unconscious of the subject. This is distinguished by him from the marvelous of romanticism, which he calls the urge to coalesce the mind and the tangible world, which led to the inauguration of the rationalist era. Breton is interested in an experience of the marvelous that is not romantic, theological, and ontological, but epistemological, deriving from the psyche and its irrational, as described by Freud. The subjective mind is a source of potential, transformation, and revolution in Breton's object. From 1934, objects became central to Nash's experimentation. Over the period of a prolonged stay in Dorset, he documented, studied, posed, and handled found objects, be they stone, flint, or driftwood, foremost lifted from the geological land. I aim to describe a figuration of the object in Nash's work that, in quiet disregard for the impositions of the rationalist era, poses an experience of the marvellous that derives explicitly from far beyond the limit of the subject and psyche. Whilst this might seem to be a lapse to the romantic marvellous described by Breton, and granted Nash's work is steeped in romanticism, it is in fact, I propose, drawn of a new object, the active new geological real, without theology. Nash's 1936 Dorset Shell Guide can be read as an articulation of his object. In a format quite particular within a series of guides for motorists, Nash foregrounds the fantastic natural forms of the Jurassic coast, the folded limestone strata of Stair Hole, the implausible land formations of Lulworth Cove, Durdledore and Chesilbank. In his words, the result of a mystical judgment called the law of compensation. Nash's photomontages of fossil fishes and improbable coastal stones accentuate a marvellous confusion between nature and design. Likewise features the naturally fantastic pine hawk moth, the patterned head of an adder, a monstrous head of an ichthyosaurus. Nash describes seeing Chalbury at twilight, cut against the afterglow, as to experience an almost unnerving feeling of the latent force of the past. The guide is a vivid encounter with vast, uncanny time and material far beyond and dwarfing of the human experience. A captivating new link by Sarah Phil between the guide and the materialism of Georges Bataille aids a new reading of it in geological context. Bataille, the debaser of surrealism, produced the journal Document from 1929 to 30 in pursuing an alternate trajectory to Bretonian surrealism's figuring of human irrationality, which he regarded as idealizing, sublimating of the base, perverse, and violent, a material irrationality into which he ventured. Nash, too, was interested in this underside, alternate to the anthropocentrism of Bretonian surrealism, and he was engaged with Document. The affinities between Document and the Dorset Guide have been described as a shared anti-humanist sentiment, Nash's guide having the nation's ancestors appear as primitive monsters. I read Nash's guide, his proposed anti-humanism, or rather his venturing beyond the bounds of an anthropocentric, surrealist marvellous, in a way that is mindful of the artist's repeated efforts to distinguish his approach from that of the Freudian unconscious. Historian Stephen Gould has noted that Freud, in one of history's least modest pronouncements, describes a set of great outrages upon the naive self-love of humanity. The first, the realization that the earth was not the center of the universe. The second, relegation to a descent from the animal world. The third, Freud's own discovery, the loss of the illusion that we at least possessed rational minds. He points out that this neglects another great outrage, the displacement of the human form from the center of the temporal realm by the discovery of deep time. Whilst Bataille's explorations revel in Freud's discovery and its base material extrapolations, Nash's encounters with objects are better understood, I propose, in the expanses of the deep time of the material land. To the chance encounter of the surrealist psyche, its coming revolution derived from the fleeting experience of the human unconscious, Nash brings the sublimated or rationally marginalized reality, the geological real. The uncanny of the Dorset Guide derives from the accident of encounter with a colossal geological time. This is an object radically exterior to the human imagination, yet Nash's guide doesn't recall a romantic encounter. Boundless deep time might be read, as noted by Breton, as a cause of the modern rationalisation of time, or the object of modern rationalising intentions. It encapsulates and instigates a live encounter with a new geological land. The new land is of formidable processes and magical minerals, seen for the first time and more. It has a pulse of a natural chronometer. It was in 1903 that Pierre Curie had found that heat emitting from the land, conceived as a process of cooling ongoing since inception, was in fact generated by the Earth's radioactivity. An Earth considered a cooling remnant was found active with process and vital, legible law flowing through. Therein, radium dating of the age of the rocks of the Earth also gave rise to the concept of minerals as ticking chronometers, of the Earth as a clock with a regular and even rhythm. Nash opens his guide to the animate face of Dorset with an excerpt from Thomas Hardy's An August Midnight. A shaded lamp and a waving blind, and the beat of a clock from a distant floor. Thus meet we five in this still place, at this point in time, at this point in space. Nash's 1937 text, The Life of the Inanimate Object, evokes a history of endowing the inanimate land with a life and personality, as do the artist's objects. He described Marche Personnage as having emanated some interminable and disquieting magic. It was patently quick with a mysterious life of its own. Nash is doing this not as intimation, but in the new geological context, the new land previously imagined as inert. It was described by Oliver Lodge in The Listener in 1929. The very materials with which we are most familiar are found to be in constant flux and are liable to change from one form to another. The atoms of matter that had been thought to be permanent and stable, unalterable foundation stones of the material universe, these atoms were found by brilliant experimenting to be not constant and inalterable at all, neither were they inert. Mary Antoine has described a context of the modern rationalisation of time to which the emergence of the contingency and chance of the surrealist object is a response. She refers to the increasing reification and standardisation of time during the early 20th century and the temporal demand of modernity. Symptomatic is Frederick W. Taylor's subjecting of the human body to temporal management. At a time when this abstracted temporal demand looms large and the surrealist object is an ephemeral release from it, Nash is struck by his found object, a vital structured form flowing beyond and not the preserve of or subject to the rational mind. I propose that Nash had an augmented sense of geological structure and emanation, antecedent to the rational mind. Nash sees that the land laying about everywhere is alive with radiant and radiant with the beat of time. It is a vision that does not accord with the anthropocentric rationality of modernity and exceeds the surrealist transformative unconscious encounter as counterpoise. His vision, in its implied flow of natural and abstract designs, signals no such duality. Nash's marvellous is not ephemeral, conditioned by the subjective unconscious. It is ontological. To conclude, I want to solve one rich geological curiosity among many amidst Nash's oeuvre. Nash's nests of wild stones in his 1937 text of the same name are characteristically evocative of stones, maths, and geology. Nash says of the stones, one may find a pair almost side by side, inseparable complements in true relation. I found them that afternoon on the Sussex Downs during an attempt to remember whether Edward James lived at East or West Dean. The problem was then not solved, but so soon as my stones came into my hands, their equation was solved, and they were united forever. There is a reference in Nash's Unseen Landscapes to the moa bird. He refers to the nests of giant birds, scattered groups of fantastic nests, a sanctuary for moas. Elsewhere in Unknown Earth, a handbook of geological enigmas, a striking discovery of stones is described, first published in Science in 1924, and by Professor Lee of the Geological Survey, who describes little heaps of semi-precious stones scattered over the plains and hills, nest-like enigmas which, following investigation, are understood to have been collections by extinct birds for use to grind food in the gizzard. Where it lay down to die at last, the pebbles endured after even its bones had disappeared. Hence the little heaps of rounded chalcedony quartz, chert, jasper, and quartzite, The extraordinary discovery of the precious stones of the Moa captivated Lee, who remarks on the good judgment of these extinct birds in choosing jewel stones for use in their lapidary mills. By judicious selection of material, these first families among diamond cutters handed down lasting memorials to admiring posterity. Nash's nest of wild stones is marvellous geological enigma, legible stones deciphered in the field with maths and the turn of a conjurer's hand. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for getting us off to an excellent start, Anna. That was smashing. That morphing animate landscape, radiant to the beat of time. We're now going to turn to the second paper of this session on local landscape, which is given by Anna Falcini. Anna is an associate lecturer in contemporary art practice at Bath Spa University, and she's also currently a fine art practice-based Ph.D. student at the University of the Creative Arts, Canterbury. And her research project and her paper today focuses on the Hoo Peninsula, this area of land in Kent positioned between the Thames and the Medway. I went there a few years ago for the first time, and it is a remarkable landscape, these extraordinary mud flats. I went there on a very bright sunny day, I remember, and the oil of grain refinery is still there as an extraordinary landmark. It's as Anna says, it's a landscape that in certain ways has evaded traditional artists in terms of their treatment of the landscape. It has literary associations, obviously with Dickens and Great Expectations, and as Anna says, with film more recently. And I suppose in art, I would think immediately, not of the landscape, but the marine scape of J.M.W. Turner, the junction of the Thames and the Medway. Anna is going to concentrate on a particular film, which I've never seen, called The Island. So I'm keen to know more about this 1952 British petroleum film called The Island, which was made as a promotional film, and interestingly with a score by Malcolm Arnold, which I've never heard. So I'm intrigued to know more. So Anna, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much to the Paul Mellon Centre for inviting me to talk. Can you all hear me? Because I have quite a quiet voice. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, good. In this paper, you said no? Yes. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry, I thought you said yes. Everyone's nodding. So in this paper, I'm proposing to explore the question of how the landscape of the Hoo Peninsula in North Kent sort of appeared to be largely overlooked as a subject for landscape painting in the 18th and 19th centuries, but how sort of through the medium of film it's become articulated and re-illuminated. So the landscape of the Hoo Peninsula has rarely been the subject of serious painting. And, you know, when artists were, that's just a little map to kind of give you a location of where the Hoo Peninsula is. It's just where the red arrow is. So when artists were sort of venturing out on plein air and capturing the sublime, this particular estuarine landscape remained stubbornly invisible. Yet where this landscape was mute as a sort of source of painting, it kind of emerged as a consistent subject matter in the media of film. And it was the backdrop in David Lean's Great Expectations and a pseudo-Vietnam in Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket. So it was also the subject of a film in 1952 called The Island, and this was to promote BP's new oil refinery in the area. So referencing these films, I'm arguing that the camera lens is a memory tool that has captured this landscape in a unique synthesis of the real and the imagined, and in a way that traditional media such as painting perhaps cannot, and that through the media of film, these qualities emerge as fluid and interchangeable. So the Hoo Peninsula is an area of land in Kent, and it's positioned between two river estuaries, the Thames and Medway. And English Heritage described it as largely characterised by arable and marshland pasture of a low-lying nature, with pockets of large industry. So it's been the site of prison hulks in the 1800s. It was a centre of manufacturing for cordite and ammunition in the early 1900s. And I'm sure you've probably been aware more recently it was proposed as a site for the new London airport by Boris Johnson. But as early as the 16th century, the peninsula was regarded as an unpleasant and unhealthy place, and the word unwholesome was used to describe it by William Lambarde in 1570. according to Mary Dobson, the academic, she talks about how marsh parishes, such as those in the Hoo Peninsula, were the most notorious black spots during the early modern period. And these black spots were the result of disease like malaria, which was also known locally as marsh fever. And they were breeding grounds basically for mosquitoes. And this was often due to the continual flooding of the land, which was breached by ineffective sea defences in the 16th century. The fleets and ditches characteristic of the peninsula continued to provide perfect breeding grounds for malaria, with the last case being reported in the 1950s. So it's within this context that one can begin to identify reasons why the landscape of the Hoo Peninsula were omitted from the great period of landscape painting in England. Edward Hasted noted that even vicars would not live in these parishes, these marsh parishes. It was hardly the picture of pastoral England that might attract the artist. And arguably, apart from its coastal activity, the landscape itself lacked the features that would attract the painter of the picturesque or the sublime of the period. Borrowing from Anne Birmingham's writings, it could be concluded that there was a decided invisibility of Horace Walpole's errant strollers gallivanting over the peninsula, because there were few examples of William Gilpin's perspectives and prominences from which to view the flat, featureless landscape from. So this perspective of a dark and untrustworthy place maintains its currency in the cultural psyche, and the writer Peter Ackroyd, in his 2008 book, Thames Sacred River, reflects upon how it exerts a primitive and still menacing force, and it's all the more eerie, he says, and lonely because of its proximity to the great city. So it's about 30 miles from London, so despite that it's got a very distinctive kind of difference from being from that city. And within this canon of historical and contemporary observations, the Hoo Peninsula was, and to some extent remains, a difficult terrain that exists at the periphery of a contemporary culture, and was hardly worth getting a pencil out for, let alone the comprehensive paraphernalia of the painter. So in this opening section, I have suggested reasons for why the Hoo Peninsula was disregarded as a serious subject matter for the landscape painter. And in the next section, I will discuss how the Hoo Peninsula has become articulated and re-illuminated through the medium of film, through a porousness of past and present. In 1952, BP began to construct the Kent oil refinery on the Isle of Grain, which is on the edge of the Hoo Peninsula. And you can see on the map, this is the Isle of Grain, which is just at the very extremity. So to allay the fears of the local communities nearby and to promote its construction, BP commissioned a film that would document the refinery's development and subtly embed the message that change was inevitable and that progress for Britain was dependent on oil. So here is a plan of the oil refinery. So it takes up quite an extensive area on the Isle of Grain. It had a big impact. And the film tells the story of the refinery through a very tightly scripted narration, and it uses a series of characters which include, these are all fictional characters, but they're based on real people. So they had the construction manager, they had workers, local farm labourers, and the parish vicar, for example. Most of the characters in the film were inevitably male, and it was narrated by a male as well. So there are very few women in the film, which is quite interesting. But it was directed by John Ingram and Peter Pickering, and the island is actually really artistically constructed as a film, and it beautifully kind of manoeuvres the film camera between industrial progress and the ancient landscape. And it persuasively presents the argument that progress is inevitable and it takes prominence over the irrevocable loss of the landscape. So I'd just like to show the first sort of clip from the island, which is the opening sequence, and it just gives you a tone and feel of how the film is pitched. it's very interesting. It's sort of very persuasive, the music, and it kind of continues in that vein. So through numerous visits, I had become familiar with entering Grain through the threshold of industry. So when you come into Grain, you have to go through this kind of industrial zone, which is very prominent, and then you reach the village and the coastline. And I would trace pathways around the shoreline. I come up against whole sections of ancient marsh, which would be compressed under concrete. And the marsh that sort of had existed for thousands of years was superseded by an oil refinery that only existed for 30 years, and whose concentric pools of black liquid were reminiscent of the black spots of disease that had earlier existed in Dobson's marsh parishes. I've got another clip here which I'll just play, which is where they're filling in fleets, and fleets were channels which were dug originally for sea defences, and then they were kind of filled in with water. So in this clip, they're filling these in.
We're filling the drain fleets now with the earth the draglines are tearing out of this hill. Already the job's speeding up, and more machines are needing more and more men. So we're making plans to look after the men once we've got them. Construction isn't just machine. The great engineers knew that, like the great generals. And when we arrive, it's pretty much like an invading army.
The sooner all these fleets are filled and the place begins to look like a refinery, the better, so far as I'm concerned. But it won't be built by wishing. There's still a lot to do. All our plans to be checked before then, even revised perhaps, if the oil situation changes, or the steel situation as well for that matter. Practically anything and everything could set our program back. I can tell you, it'll be a great day when I see our first tanker pumping oil ashore.
I really love that sort of last shot there. It's just very evocative. So what captivated me in the film was the opportunity to see Grain through a camera lens, to see a landscape in transition that captured the memory of it at a critical point of change. As the camera lens captured the activity, the memory of it became imprinted, absorbing the transformation of the landscape. And there is a porousness of both past and present between scenes that have changed very little, contrasted with scenes where the landscape is mechanically manoeuvred into new geographies. From a position of posterity and time past, the immateriality of film has captured a landscape that is evocative and provokes the palpable. So I've got one last scene here from the island to show you, which is very, going back to the romanticised idea of a landscape.
Down on the marsh, things are happening so fast you'd think they couldn't change it quick enough. Everywhere, lorries, machines, and strange faces. But last summer, with the work going on in the fields, it was all different. Everything was set. There was a peace about then, of men working to the season. I remember my old dad telling how his cousin came back from America, promised to set him up, but he never did. Only this refinery has come to stay. They're really spending money not talking about it.
So I think that last shot is, it's almost like a painting, and it's sort of a very romanticised kind of vision. Sorry, I'm just going to flick over that one. In his chapter, Film as Spatial Critique, the artist Patrick Keeler discusses how film, and I quote, offers possibilities to experience spatial qualities no longer encountered in ordinary experience because they no longer exist. Spaces that no longer exist, he says, may still physically exist, but not socially, or they may no longer exist at all. So Keeler suggests that film has a capacity to offer the possibility to experience spaces of the past. So my encounters on the Isle of Grain were redrawn beyond what Keeler defined as an ordinary experience. I was suddenly able, through the medium of film, to go beyond what I knew into an expanded experience, that of the place that Keeler understood as long since existing, from the Deleuzian position of a single observer, into a multifaceted potential of the cinematic. And entangled in the 26 minutes of irreversible change to Grain, I am suspended into in-betweenness. Nicholas Cullinan, in his responding to Tacita Dean's work in film at the Turbine Hall in Tate Modern, says, where some see fossilization in the subjects captured by the camera lens, I see revivification. Every time the projector is switched on, these images are summoned back to life once more. So that's just a historic photograph of the oil refinery as it was being constructed, which is quite interesting. You just get a sense of the impact. And the previous one, just going back here, that was originally the Admiralty had an oil refinery which had already been established on the Isle of Grain. So BP kind of took that and extended it to make this new one. So the positioning of the Hoo Peninsula appears as a setting in two feature films I have identified, Great Expectations and Full Metal Jacket. Where landscape painting in the 18th and 19th centuries was excited by the Claudian prospects and panoramas, and later what Anne Birmingham describes as intimate and occluded views that presented nature as rough, shaggy and humble, the estuary's stark, uncompromising, windswept extremity could be put to good use for settings of dark and obdurate narratives. The critic J. Cox observes that the film director Stanley Kubrick was interested in functional unreality when he was recreating scenes of Vietnam in deserted gasworks in the Thames estuary in Full Metal Jacket. Kubrick enjoyed a realism that was reconstructed and that was ambiguous. And the choice for Kubrick to use cliff, a wide open expanse of marsh in the Hoo Peninsula in one section of the film, seems a pertinent choice. It was an area that could be transformed into Kubrick's scenes of rural Vietnam. I'm sure you probably know the film, but Full Metal Jacket is a film about the experience of a platoon of American soldiers during the Vietnam War. And amongst the scenes that Kubrick shot at Cliff is an aerial shot where the camera frames 3 soldiers inside a military helicopter as one of them fires at innocent civilians below running over the terrain. So I would just like to show you that image and that film clip. So the scene is one of violence and menace, yet simultaneously the mysterious terrain of the land below is a counterpoint that Kubrick interweaves into a binary image. The multiple framing of the camera lens, the helicopter door, and of the cinema screen sets the landscape into an ambiguous position. Kubrick frames the scene as though it is seen through the soft glow of a clawed glass, and he achieves what Alexandra Harris in her book Weatherland attributes to the device as an atmospheric viewing of Cliff. The clawed glass was surely a filmic device in its infancy, with its many ranges of tinted glass for all different scenes, with viewing strategies that distanced the viewer from the subject matter and created illusions of landscape. I tried to lay my own memory over the image from the screen to visually register the Cliff of Kubrick with my own mental images, never quite lining up the register perfectly, creating a double image that blurs at the edges. Juliana Bruno says that film literally comes to life as light dancing onto a surface screen, and she cites Peter Greenaway's words, that cinema is the business of artificial light, catching or trapping the light permanently onto the surface. I can play this scene repeatedly and bring alive through luminosity this particular section of the Hoo Peninsula. Long after the film is finished, the image still dances on my eyes. 40 years earlier, in 1946, David Lean had decided to film Charles Dickens' novel Great Expectations, and he would compose a number of scenes on location in and around the North Kent marshes. In the novel, Dickens builds a vivid visual image of the marshes in the opening chapters of the book through the climatic phenomenon of fogs, bitter winds, and mists, which are all familiar motifs of the North Kent marshes. If you've ever been down there in the winter, it's particularly atmospheric in terms of weather. And Dickens writes of the dark, flat wilderness. He identifies the lower leaden line beyond which the wind was rushing was the sea. So in Lean's opening shot from his film, we observe the central character, Pip, running along this low leaden line with an aural soundscape of an eerie wind, menacing music and birdsong. So I'm just going to go, these are some drawings that I did around Dickens' kind of Great Expectations, kind of narratives. So I'm going to just go to this sort of next film clip, which is the opening sequence from Great Expectations. So, and what's interesting is this scene here is a shot in the studio, and these were scenes that were painted by these sort of set designers. And the preceding shot was actually on the cliff on the Peninsula. So he, David Lean was very clever in the way he kind of worked, with that landscape, kind of through fiction and through actual real landscape. But although I recognise the territory of the marshes in this opening scene, it sort of appears to me sort of disembodied and a distinctly constructed image. And where the real and the imaginary begin to synthesise is in a scene between Pip and Biddy. And Biddy is the character who comes to run the Gargery house when Pip's sister dies. So I'd like to just show you that clip, and then I'll just talk a little bit about that.
The occasion was marked for me not so much by the passing of Mrs. Joe as by the arrival of Biddy. Very soon she became a trusted friend to both of us, and a blessing to the household.
Biddy, I want you to help me. Don't I help you, Pip? Oh yes, you help me out with letters and figures. But this is a secret. Oh? What is it? Biddy? Yes? Biddy, I want to be a gentleman. A gentleman? Oh, I wouldn't if I was you, Pip. I don't think you would answer. Biddy, I have a particular reason for wanting to be a gentleman. Well, you know best, Pip, but don't you think you're happy as you are? I'm not happy as I am. I'm coarse and common. Coarse and common, are you, Pip? Who said so? Beautiful young lady, Miss Havisham. And I want to be a gentleman on her account.
So in this scene, Lean has embedded the subtleties and details of the place, which are kind of really resonant in the contemporary landscape. So the activation of landscape by the continual wind across the flat marsh. There's a very particular bird song that you hear, particularly in the summer months, which he's kind of got in there as well. And then it's beautiful light that he's kind of got on Pip and Biddy's faces. And then the large open skies. And then these reeds where Pip is are very reminiscent of, areas around Cliff. So there are traces or particles suspended in the frames of the film that are revived and reconnect the landscape through the overlay of past and present. The film holds them in suspension as though archived, and then in a revivification they are transversal. Here the methodology of film allows for a multi-sensory reading through the visual, audio, imaginary and real, onto a medium that is immaterial and which relies upon a series of actions and strategies to view the work. In the space of the cinema, the viewer is suspended momentarily and immersed into the scene, with the cinema screen and the canvas becoming resonant surfaces that hold the visual. So, to summarise, I have argued that the Hoo Peninsula is a landscape that was not regarded as a subject for landscape painting, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, but that through a number of embedded characteristics of historical opinion and incident, the landscape was latterly appropriated for film and became a pertinent subject matter. Exploring how the process of film has captured the landscape, I have, through Greenaway's and Cullinan's theories, argued that the camera lens is a memory tool that directly prints onto the film tape and traps the images of the place onto the material, while also being a medium that entangles the fictional. In Juliana Bruno's work, Surfaces, she proposes that the screen is the surface that clothes filmic matters. She said that it is a fabrication and the fabric of the film. Perhaps here is the point where film and painting briefly merge through the fabric of the canvas and the film screen, which acts as a resonant surface. The fabrication of the film process is where the physical moment of time is captured onto the celluloid of Ingram and Pickering's film stock and is reignited by artificial light, activating the lost landscape buried beneath the oil refinery's concrete tanks. Bruno suggests that there is a fascination with the surface that came to prominence in modernity and which resurfaces today. The cinematic surface allows for the landscape of the Hoo Peninsula through the filmic play onto the surfaces to be re-illuminated, so that through a variety of visions, perspectives and treatments, the subject matter emerges through the porousness of not just past and present, but fictions and narratives. The treatment of it in these fictions is at the margins, authentic to its geography and to its memory in cultural terms. Caught in this obscure creek, the Hoo Peninsula remains elusive and ambiguous, a place of Kubrick's functional unreality. Thank you.
So we've had two, I think, excellent, thoughtful papers there, both discussing landscapes which are visible and yet at times invisible, talking about landscapes that are morphing and animate, strange and yet familiar. A landscape of the now, but a landscape which is also aged. The whole notion of time and the age of the earth, I think, was brought together in both. And both drew out, I think, very well issues of the local, a local which actually does transcend the familiar and the known or the descriptive and the topographical. I think both papers make us reflect upon the spiritual and the material and the tensions and exchanges between the two, and maybe we can think more about that. Both papers focused again on the role of the modern, on technology, and the camera lens, the film, progress, and landscape, of course. We're talking about landscape now, which is the subject of this conference, because landscape then was always landscape now, and landscape, through the passage of time, always becomes a landscape of memory. And we're looking back some 70, 80 years to something which was very fresh, very new, very now at the time, just pre-war and post-war. So I'd just like to open it up to the floor. I don't know whether we have a mic or whether we need a mic, but so who'd like to kick us off with any general or particular thoughts or observations? Yes.
I think I was referring, to the modern kind of rationalisation of time in terms of surrealist theory, and ideas by Marianne Dewan, where she was talking about the imposition of time upon the body, the kind of efficiency and the objectification of the body through its through time, through the wearing of the wristwatch, the use of time to manage and to rationalise the body. Is that? I mean, I could probably expand.
Yeah, I guess it's just a strange phrase because it seems to me time is
just gonna...
quite irrational.
There's a mic coming your way.
No, it just struck me as a bit strange because I'm not familiar with that particular theorist you're referring to, because time is in itself quite rational. It's a problem about geometry and where you are in the universe. But then I think it's just applying it to the body is kind of an interesting application of it,
Yeah, it's a very problematic and kind of challenging, but I guess in terms of the broader context, we're talking about the time of the introduction of Greenwich Mean Time as well, so the kind of global introduction of a kind of temporal structure on the Earth as well. So
you're talking about
standardization of time, I would be another way of saying what I mean. Yeah.
Gonna get fit doing this.
Thank you. Sarah's getting a lot of exercise here, which is great. She's already had some this morning, and now she's getting a lot more.
Well, thank you both for two wonderful papers, and really set off the conference in a very interesting way. I was wondering about the relationship between, as it were, the present at the moment that the objects that you're writing on were being made, and the negotiation with the past from that particular vantage point of just pre or just post Second World War, and particularly thinking about whether, I mean, I don't think either of you emphasized the idea of neo-romanticism, but it did seem to me that there were several layers of neo-romantic thinking. I thought, Anna F., your own photos were actually wonderfully neo-romantic, and actually picking up an idiom which reached directly back to the picturesque. So I'm wondering if stuff like David Mellon's writing on A Paradise Lost, and whether in fact both of the projects that you're looking at inhabit a kind of neo-romantic moment. And I was thinking particularly just two points of reference that hovered there, that neither of you, necessarily, I don't know whether they were consciously there in the works you're talking about or in your work, but I couldn't help thinking of William Dyce's Pegwell Bay and the fossils, and so there's already a kind of layering of thinking about fossils and beaches and the weirdness of time which is well established in British culture, and then also thinking about John Constable's Hadley Castle, which, although it doesn't actually show the landscape you're looking at, it looks in that direction, and it's all about kind of loss and melancholy. So I just wonder how many layers there are embedded in what you're talking about, and whether neo-romanticism is a useful term to describe them.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim Barringer. Thank you very much. Anna, do you want to?
Yeah.
We can both have a go at this one.
Well, David Miller's writing was really important to my work here, and it was really about drawing on that tradition and the geological within the neo-romantic tradition, and trying to look through Blake's geological ideas around Albion, and look at that and sort of also to read the neo-romantic, to make a new reading in a sense that did account for the new geological theory, which hasn't necessarily been. So I guess a rereading of neo-romanticism of Nash's neo-romanticism in that sense. But obviously at the time, in the 30s, it was sort of not, in some sense, it was, along with the kind of being English and the Englishness of the landscape, it was sort of not the done thing. And Nash was very, very eclectic and very good at sort of moving between groups and across fields. And so I don't think he kind of declared his kind of, his neo-romantic sort of, Blakean kind of geological influences were not necessarily always fully declared, but he was, he was very much drawing on that, and that was, and the the attendance to the empirical in that as well, which seems not to have been declared openly or seen. So yes, the neo-romantic and the geological within that is incredibly important to what I've been writing. And Anna, did you want to respond?
Yeah, sure. So can I just clarify, the photographs you sort of suggested had a kind of, that I'd taken had a romantic kind of connotation, even the one with the rifle. There was one with the rifle in. You found that romantic? No. Okay. I think it's interesting. Thank you. No, it's fine. I mean, I confess, I do, have a romantic kind of way that I look at that landscape. I've got a very strong connection to it through kind of a number of years living there. I had a Dutch barge. We lived in the landscape, and so I became very connected to it. And I confess, I look at it through that lens. And also, I think because my background is, I've got a lot of creative kind of people in my family, and my grandfather was an artist, and he was, constantly taking photographs, but also working in the landscape through watercolour. And I found, that was also kind of part of my kind of critical training, really, as a sort of young child. And so I definitely come at it from that romantic kind of, sensibility. And I think, but interestingly at the moment, the Hoo Peninsula is at a kind of very important tipping point in its history. It's a huge space that's kind of open at the moment, and it's a vast landscape in terms of very close to London, and it's being looked at all the time in terms of development. But there's obviously a huge kind of force of people trying to protect it. So I think it's at a time of change, and I think because of that, there is suddenly a lot of people are looking at it with interest, and trying to kind of capture. I'm certainly trying to kind of just capture it at this moment, because I'm sure inevitably it's going to change, and it's going to be further developed. And I think I went to an exhibition last night, actually, at Flowers East. Nadav Kanda's just done a whole series of photographs of the Thames estuary. And they are, also they're looking mostly out from the landscape at the coastline. So they're not looking inwards, they're looking outwards. And they are, essentially, they're quite open, liminal kind of photographs, and they have this sense of that sort of romantic overtone. So I do think, there is that sort of sensibility at the moment in looking at that landscape.
It is fascinating, as you say, that tipping point was with the oil refinery in the 50s, and that subsides, and then Boris wants to turn it into an airport. Jill Perry.
Yeah, my point is a continuation of Tim's, I think, about neo-romantic framing. I mean, I loved the clip you showed us of the island, the BP refinery. It seemed to me that one of the key factors in that kind of attempt to sort of neo-romanticise the project was the islandness of it. Yeah. You're seen approaching it by ship, the sea is all around it. You're creating this kind of, I don't know I hesitate to use the word utopian, but utopian context for a refinery. And this is British, albeit Anglo-Iranian. And it seemed to me that was a key factor, and I wondered, because I've never seen that film, and I think it's wonderful, and as I'm working on islands, I'd love to see it. But it did seem to me to be a key factor in reframing, representing, reconstructing that landscape as somehow desirable and modern, even.
I think that's a very good point, yeah. The film, if you get to watch it, it's got these two sides to it. They present this kind of modernity, this construction of the oil refinery, and then they present this landscape that's kind of, sort of from that perspective of the pastoral. So these two things are kind of presented in that film, alongside each other. But there's this sort of, overwhelming, this landscape has to be sacrificed for this, oil refinery. And I think it is interesting because the history of the Isle of Grain, it was an island, and then it kind of, they filled in the channel and it became an isle. And then it was opened up again to be an island because they wanted to kind of take shipping through that channel. So it's got all these interesting kind of, it's always had this kind of between an island and not, And at one point, sometimes the local people who I spoke to said in the sort of 60s, you know, the bus sometimes couldn't leave the island because, you know, the tide would come up too high, so they would be stranded on the island. And the community there often feels that they're very much kind of at the periphery and forgotten about and just used. So when all this sort of thing happened with the airport, you know, they were really disregarded, and they were just totally, you know, well, we'll just move, you know, these people, and, you know. And so there's kind of lots of interesting kind of tensions in that landscape, and because of that island geography.
Hamad, just here.
Thank you once again for those wonderfully contrasting papers. But they shared one thing which I was really struck by, was both your approaches to the local. And sort of the memory sort of went to the 10th century polymath Al-Biruni, who also had a crater named after him. And his concept of this, of an egocentric map, which we now recognize as sort of Google mapping, but which places the self in the middle. And then you map the rest of the world according to yourself. Now, he was also he wrote the first book of anthropology on India, never having been to India, by interviewing prisoners who he was sort of cohabiting with, and then also mapped to within few decimal points the circumference of the Earth. So what I was really struck by were these two examples that you're looking at in Dorset and the Hoo Peninsula, but really, you know, going Al-Biruni on it. And particularly, I think, with the use of the film from BP, and of course the Anglo-Iranian example, I wonder if you sort of looked at the work of Nasrin Tabatabai and Baba Kafrasabi, and their work, the Seep, it's called. It's also based on BP's archival films in 1948 in Iran. And I think there was something really interesting at what BP was doing, and a number of artists have sort of started looking at BP in particular, and their look at the land and what it contains, and what seeps out of it. So I think that may be of interest to you.
That sounds really interesting.
So
yeah.
that's the seep as in SEEP. Yeah. Who would like to respond or comment to that?
Oh, well, I guess, yeah, the idea of the locals is to take that. I guess it was a source of great anxiety for Nash's generation, I guess, in terms of Englishness. And it comes again and again as a question. And I guess, you know, with this sort of time of sort of global landscape and the tensions there with the English, the idea of the English, it was a very interesting tension to play with. I guess there was a sort of sense in my work of trying to sort of be fully in full awareness and full kind of appreciation of my own kind of parochial position as a kind of English art historian, and you know, in a context of sort of global biennial culture and global art histories. So there's that there to play with.
Yes. So just picking up on your sort of, you know, question in terms of the local, you know, there is a sense, there's a very distinctive feel about that landscape in the Hoo Peninsula. And it, you know, it's very unique, and people living there, you know, are very sort of interconnected, you know, quite a tight-knit communities, quite small populations. But then it also has quite an interesting global kind of connection, as you pointed out, with the oil refinery. And, you know, it's always had this outward-looking face to it, really. You know, there's always been this kind of, at the moment, the oil refinery sort of was closed down and then became a sort of deep-sea shipping port. So containers now come in and go out from that place. So again, you know, and that port is owned by, I think it was the Whampoa kind of, you know, business in Hong Kong. So it's fascinating to sort of like start to map those kind of, you know, global interests, and, you know, where they're sort of coming from.
We have a question, Martina, here, and then we have another one here, and we have another one there. So we don't want to disenfranchise that side of the room. So I think we'll go to Martina, and we'll go right over there, and then we'll come back here.
I just wanted to ask Anna Reid whether, we've been talking about oil refineries, and looking at the page from the Dorset guide, a shell guide, and I assume it's not seashells, but shell oil. And I just wondered, in this conversation that we've been having about oil, and of course it involves geology and exploration, whether there's a connection in relation to your thinking about Nash.
Well, yes, it's something I just wrote fossil fuels, oil down as well. I mean, it's something that's really present, and obviously Nash was, I'm sure, aware of a little bit of the irony of, of his guide, and that, it's this guide for motorists specifically, the ideas of pollution and the denudation of the land and neo-romanticism with that, are really there and really present. But I think that, in terms of Nash's sort of, what I'm calling his sort of geological realism, there was specifically an attitude that sort of doesn't exploit and objectify the land in a sense. So it's quite an interesting alternate geological perspective to that of Shell oil, I guess, which I don't think I can overstate that point, but it seems to be a tension that's there. And the fact that his guide was so out of the ordinary in the series was really nice, and I'm sure he was aware of playing with that.
I wonder how Shell came to him.
Well, I think it was through sort of John Betjeman, I think, and Nash talked about wanting the guide to be a bit like John Betjeman's guide, or I think he sort of distanced himself from some of the other more standard guides. So there was definitely a kind of irony and a playfulness that I'm not sure that the Shell commissioners were fully aware of. And he did that with lots of contexts where he worked with kind of country life and things like that as well, where he was always sort of slightly subverting. So, I think it was, Nash, the war artist, can do a nice guide for us from Shell's point of view. It would be good to look into that more, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. We have, just as a general point, if you ask a question, it's probably useful to state your name, since this is being recorded for posterity. Okay, so, yeah.
Thanks. Mark Cheatham. Thanks for both papers, very stimulating. I've a question about Kubrick, though, mostly for Anna number 2. There's a very strong sense of both invasion and of, kind of rootedness in the various different clips that you chose to show. And in an answer a moment or two ago, you also mentioned not just the local, but locals, people who live there. And I wonder both how much research you've done on the locals' responses to these various invasions, or indeed to having their area depicted as home, and what kinds of responses you might have found, or that you would imagine you would find.
In terms of responses to things happening to the peninsula, do you mean?
Kubrick's film could not be less about where it was shot.
Yeah.
To be frank. Some of the other films, the BP film, in a sense, was a desecration of that area. Was there much response locally, is what I'm asking.
In terms of the BP film, a lot of people that I spoke to, I've been working with a group of women who are sort of in their 60s and 70s, and they have a lunch club every month. So I've been going to Grain to talk to them. And a lot of them were young children when the oil refinery was being built. So they remember it. They don't necessarily see it as a negative thing. They actually see it as a positive because it brought employment to the area, and it sort of sustained the Isle of Grain. It is a very remote place in terms of being very disconnected, and in the 50s and 60s it was even more so because there was just, a bus maybe a couple of times a day, and people didn't drive so much. So you can imagine that it was very disconnected in those times. So there's a mixed feeling about these things. And I guess, industry now in those areas is still seen not necessarily in a negative way. I think in terms of the airport that was proposed, that was very, antagonistic, and people were very upset about that. I mean, basically the attitude from, sort of politicians at the time was, that they were talking about the landscape, and this place, this would serve the UK, a bit like BP, it would serve the UK for an airport, we need this infrastructure. and totally disregarded people. I had a very pertinent conversation with a gentleman on the coastline who said to me, my wife is buried in All Hallows churchyard, which is near to Grain. What will happen? Will they dig her body up? And it was really moving, talking to people. So on the ground, there's a real mix. There is resistance to people coming to the Hoo Peninsula in terms of, I'm an artist. You have to tread quite carefully when you're in those places because people feel like things are done to them and not with them. So you have to build a lot of trust up. So it's quite interesting. There are lots of interesting tensions. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. We had a question in the centre here. So if you want to whiz the mic over, Sarah.
Hello, I'm Alexandra Harris.
Hello.
Thank you for your papers. This is, I'm afraid, a big question about landscape, but any glimpse of your thoughts on it would be great. It's inspired by your talking about a place which is not fit for art, and then suddenly it is. And I want to think about this whole amazing process by which, if you live in the 1790s, Herefordshire is the place. If you're in the 1920s, let's all go to Dorset or the South Downs. And now, isn't it all about flatness? It's the fens. And I suppose I associate nature writing now with starting with, I suppose, waterland. And yet you've just taken us back into lean. Is your case study a way of helping us to see how this process happens? Is it really true that no one paints flatness before the 1950s? Can we sort of open this out to a sense of, taking the Hoo as an exemplary marshland and learn something about these processes that bring a kind of topography to the fore? Sorry if that's really big, but I'm just totally fascinated by it.
No, thank you. Thank you for your question. It's really interesting. I think I was just sort of using the Hoo Peninsula as an example, perhaps, of it was a place that I feel was overlooked because I've looked and researched and tried to explore whether there was painting that happened in, that place. But it seemed to be, Turner had visited the area and done sort of, paintings from the coastline of, from Sheerness. But I didn't really find evidence that people had kind of, used that landscape in painting. I think, obviously, in the Dutch landscapes, there would be more of a sense of that being represented through, the flatness of landscape in those kind of paintings. Sorry, can I...
There's a lot more to say about that, but I'm aware as chair that it is 11:30 and some of you are probably gagging for a cup of coffee. That was an excellent opening session. We had lots of good conversations to begin with, and I learned a new word, Alberunian, which is fantastic. It's always nice to learn something. So we welcome you back in half an hour at midday. So thank you all very much, and thank you to our two speakers.